Welcome, everyone. Today is Thursday, April 11th, 2024. We are meeting on behalf of the CAPC project under Cluster API and SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We are a CNCF community and we abide by their code of conduct. So thank you in advance for being kind to one another, respectful. Please look for the raise hands feature in Zoom to speak. We certainly welcome all of your voices and commentary. And without further ado, on that note, I would like to pause for a few seconds to welcome anyone who's new to this discussion, maybe new to the community. If you want to raise your hand and say hi and introduce yourself, now's a great chance to do that.
Yeah, I don't know how to raise that hand in Zoom, but my name is Vineet Agarwal, and this is the first time I have joined this particular office hours. I work for Google, and I've been pretty interested with that CAPI, overall CAPI projects. I've been playing around with CAPI and CAPZ and all, and thinking about building some kind of projects, uh, across the cloud providers. So I've been playing with that, especially on the Azure side, like building that Kubernetes platform in Azure, both self-managed and the managed. And then I had a couple of questions regarding that. So that's the reason that I want to join this one. And going forward, I also like to contribute. It seems pretty interesting projects and very close to my heart. I have been working on Kubernetes for last 5-6 years, and have implemented many of the Kubernetes implementations for my previous organization. I used to work for McKinsey & Company, so I did consulting for many of the customers, implemented Kubernetes there itself. So pretty interested in the whole idea of CAPI, CAPC, and the promises that it brings.
Great. That was a wonderful introduction. Welcome, Vineet. Thank you for taking the time to introduce yourself. I'm going to paste in Zoom chat here a link to the Google Doc that we use to track agenda. So if you could just add your own agenda item into the April 11th section.
Yeah, I tried to.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I tried to access the agenda document, but I don't have that one. So I requested that. So if you can give me access, I can definitely add that.
I think, does anybody know, do you have to, I feel like it's open to the public. Anyone can.
No.
Last I knew you had to be part of, you just had to join the SIG Cluster Lifecycle mailing list, and then you're just automatically access.
Okay, cool. So I'll add your agenda item for you. So I'll copy that link. You don't have to do that here in real time.
Sure.
And then someone here who has access will take some notes. I'm going to say, Vineet, and you want to talk about.
I wanted to understand the CAPI and CAPZ's limitations, if there is any. Let's say I want to use CAPI and CAPZ for setting up AKS clusters. Is there any limitations of the products of the CAPI or CAPZ at this point? Like, what are the features that's missing right now? And any limitation, like let's say CAPZ can be able to create less than 500 clusters, or the cluster with less number of nodes, something like that. Any limitation that I'm aware I need to know before we get into that the implementation part.
Okay, great. That I think that coalesces nicely with John's agenda item. He'll speak to some of that in terms of the AKS question in particular. But then we can talk in more detail about where we can anticipate you running into limitations based on your scenario.
Yeah.
All right. So at the end, we're going to do some issue review, and that means I think we're going to go to agenda. I want to talk about cutting a patch release. We can also do that after the agenda section. So without further ado, John, you have the first agenda item. The floor is yours.
Cool, thanks. So yeah, I just wanted to announce that we're starting a new feature flag in CAPZ. And this is basically a feature which enables some new resources that kind of live in parallel with the existing resources. And they have a completely different API structure, which is basically raw ASO. So if you want to learn more about what that might look like, I put quick docs. I threw some stuff in the docs in that PR. So that provides a little bit of background about what that is. I do want to clarify that like the existing API, we have no changes in commitment to that. This is purely a new thing that we're trying out, mostly targeting new users. So any changes to the existing API are completely hypothetical at this point. So don't worry about things changing underneath you with breaking changes anytime soon. But yeah, so basically what we're trying to accomplish at a high level here is unlocking like advanced use cases where hopefully this way we can expose basically every AKS feature in every API version supported by ASO kind of in one foul swoop and kind of keep that going on an ongoing basis. And hopefully this will also make things like adopting existing AKS clusters easier and overall just kind of making CabZ a lot more lean in its core, but then making it kind of extensible with things on top of it. So then CabZ itself can become quite a bit easier to maintain going forward while still trying to make all these really niche, interesting use cases possible in the future. So if anybody has any questions or has looked at this PR and kind of is clued into what's going on already, I'd be happy to answer those. Otherwise, please keep your eye on the PRQ and you'll see this progress quickly. I do have a POC up and running that I can demo here in the next few weeks to kind of show this in action. And currently we are working on PRing that into CabZ kind of chunk by chunk. So hopefully we can get this all stood up for the 1.15 release next month in a kind of somewhat usable state for people to try. And yeah, I think that's all I had. Jack, did you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce the scope of this in the near term, like in the next, I don't know, 3 to 6 months. We're going to focus on the AKS story. I feel like John and I are sort of equally convinced that this can work really well for AKS, because in the AKS scenario, we're really already in the situation where we're bound by a downstream API. And so our efforts in CapZ to sort of create a middleware abstraction layer that's sort of CapZ native that represents that downstream API is it's a lot of work, and it's always sort of incomplete. I shouldn't say sort of, it's always incomplete. So Mike, you certainly know about this because you've been using this for a while now. The set of AKS features that we implement in CapZ tends to be, hopefully, it's primarily the set of features that the user community is begging us for. So we prioritize that. But we're always behind. And, AKS, to its credit, is always moving forward. And to be able to reuse ASO, which is a sort of similarly a middleware with a downstream API, but it's doing so very transparently and with entirely automated. You get the entire AKS API surface area, and the trade-off is that we're now essentially exposing the ASO data structure to CapZ users. So at the beginning, I feel like we had a preference for having an opinionated CapZ data structure UX, so that building AKS clusters in CapZ felt familiar from a CapZ and a cluster API perspective. And so the current API that we have that builds AKS clusters in CapZ reflects that. And I think it's been a process where we have now realized that preference is less, I think, valuable to users, and to potentially growing the set of users who could innovate using cluster API and AKS. The idea that we would have our own opinionated API in CapZ is outweighed by the fact that we can't expose the full feature set. So we're going to make that trade-off in this experimental feature flag and take a bet that folks might like it, and then I would imagine long-term, the idea would be that we would deprecate the existing API, but that's not, as John said, it's not something to mention, to worry about in the near term. But it's definitely worth mentioning in a public meeting like this. Like that's the sort of potential path forward in the long term, 18 months, 3 years. If folks who want to do CAPZ, AKS, and really at this point it becomes more like happy AKS innovations, if they prefer this full feature set and access to the raw ASO data structure, then I think that will be the long-term path. I know I could talk a lot. Mike, does this make sense to you? Have any thoughts?
I'm excited about it. I've been watching the PR. I just haven't had a chance to actually really, or not just this PR, but just the conversations around it as much as I can. I think this is great. I'm really excited to give it a try.
Cool. And hopefully the breakage for existing users is not too onerous. I'm not sure how cattle-y your clusters are, but if they are, then hopping onto a new API while still supporting the old API and doing a transition probably isn't super horribly painful. But I think that a fully back forward compat where we do a full data mutation, I think that's probably going to be out of scope. I think that's too hard.
That's fair. I mean, technically with the importing functionality, the way it kind of works, if you were to, you could probably still do a migration yourself, kind of not optimally, but you could still import that AKS cluster.
Well, one cool thing that could definitely work is, so Willie and John are working on AKS adoption. So
right, that's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
The normal scenario that we're thinking of is probably either someone who's totally new to Cluster API and is just going to use Cluster API for that gesture and wants to say manage a fleet of AKS clusters at scale, or has some other reason why they want to use Kubernetes to manage their AKS environment. And but it also there could be a scenario where we have legacy CAPZ AKS users, and we can simply orphan those existing clusters from the existing API and adopt them using the new API, and now there's your conversion right there. Something like that.
Yeah,
could be the preferred path.
That's exactly what I was thinking when I was hearing this stuff. So that's pretty awesome.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, John. Super excited about this. And I think we can move on to Vineet. So Vineet, I would welcome an open-ended conversation about your scenarios, and we can try to give you a sense of the frontier of what is possible and what's currently not possible.
Awesome.
So the conversation we just had speaks to the AKS limitation. So right now, CAPZ supports it has its own abstraction API for representing an AKS cluster and Cluster API. It's called Azure Managed Cluster. There's two APIs that fulfill the CAPI contract: Azure Managed Cluster and Azure Managed Control Plane. And so those are like opinionated CAPZ, CAPI native representations of an AKS cluster. And the primary limitation that exists there now is full feature support for all AKS features. So I think the feature support for whatever you want to call the most commonly used features is robust. So Mike and other folks have been using CAPZ in production at scale to manage AKS for a while. And so to the extent that we have a few personas in this space that are doing things the way that you would expect most folks to do it, that feature support is there. But as you probably, I don't know how familiar you are with AKS, but it is at this point in time, it's a pretty broad feature set. There's a lot of ways to use it. And so it's not that hard to discover a particular AKS scenario that CAPZ doesn't support. So
Got
that is
it.
one limitation that we're addressing with this new API.
Okay. So right now there is no limitation that I create an AKS cluster with CAPI and CAPZ, and I can have any number of nodes. So there is no limitation in that terms. Yeah, how many cluster that I can create? What's the size of that cluster? I can. So those are not the problem.
That's correct. So those types of limitations, we're bound by any AKS limitation. So I believe right now AKS has an upper limit of 5,000 nodes. So we would inherit that kind of AKS platform limitation. But in terms of CAPC and CAPI are not going to limit your ability to run a fully scaled out AKS cluster or set of clusters. Where you're going to run into limitations is just operationally. So in Cluster API, you need a Kubernetes cluster, a management cluster to contain essentially the set of states for all of your resources that are under management. And so depending on the size of your etcd footprint, for example, depending on on what your clusters are doing, how dynamic they are, and how much CPU you have in your control plane, how much memory you have so those kinds of things will impact your ability to scale your fleet out. So that would be irrespective of CAPZ or Kappa or CAPG or CAPD or anything.
Got it. Okay.
In Cluster API, they have there is an organized effort to do scale tests using the Docker provider.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's still sort of nascent, but there are folks working on that. So if you join the Cluster API office hours or ping people in that community, you can get involved in those scaling test scenarios.
Okay.
Go ahead, John. You're raising your hand.
Yeah, the one other thing to think about in terms of scale that you wouldn't see with just plain AKS is with ASO, since CAPZ uses ASO for all of its managing AKS resources. ASO does do a periodic resync of every single resource every X amount of time, which by default is 1 hour. And with the default Azure subscription limit of 1,200 requests per hour, that means that kind of a default installation of ASO can handle basically 1,200 resources at most without getting throttled. So there is a way to configure that resync period to whatever you need it to be. And I will throw a link in chat with the links to their docs for that.
That will be helpful. Yeah.
And this is a general. Thanks for bringing this up, John. One of the things about introducing a reconciliation actor like a Kubernetes controller to manage anything in Azure is you are increasing the amount of API calls that go to Azure because these things are just happening.
Awesome.
So essentially the easiest way for a goal state reconciler like this, you're calling the Azure APIs and you're essentially saying, what's your state of the world? This is my goal state of the world. If that differs, then I'm going to go work towards achieving goal state. And in order to do that, there's some sort of API call handshaking that goes on. Get me what you think compared to what I think. And if it's the same, we're good. I'll requeue in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it is. But that sort of fundamental behavior is going to produce more API calls versus, like, let's say using the CLI or using the portal, creating an AKS cluster and then managing it like on demand. Like, okay, now I need to scale out. So I'm going to go and call up the portal. And so the portal will do some API calls, but all that on-demand maintenance that folks are maybe used to doing with any Azure service is going to produce fewer calls. Whereas if you have a Kubernetes cluster running a controller continually every 10 minutes, so you have to take that into account. So it might, if you're at the edge, if you're sort of managing like 100 clusters in one subscription, you might find that is harder with something like Cluster API, because for every one of those 100 clusters, there is additional API overhead to the Azure APIs. And so you're going to be running up against those call limits And so you're going
Okay.
to have side effects like your subscription might be throttled,
Okay.
say 2 hours every day. So that's not something you want. So
Yeah. Is there any way that it can be configured through CAPI and CAPZ?
the periodic resync
Yeah.
interval, yes,
Yeah. It can be done through that. Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. So that can mitigate that particular risk. Yeah. Let's say I don't want to do it. I just want to do this syncing once in a day. That's about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. That's possible, depending on that's pretty infrequent, but I mean, depending on how locked down your environment is, that
Yeah.
might be appropriate because there might be no reason to
Yeah.
suspect that every 10 minutes some other actor might change your configuration and you need
Yeah.
to overwrite that.
Right. Yeah.
But that would be the risk you take, is that if some other actor were to say update your configuration to a setting that is different from Cluster API, which is authoritative, then it's gonna take a day for Cluster API to notice
Yeah.
and to reapply what your goal state is.
Sure. Makes sense. Okay.
Cool.
So that's the limitation that I can work on. So there are a couple of more questions. So one is like, I see a book, a CAPZ book. How often that book is updated based upon the new information that you guys are working on? Is it pretty latest and all the information is current?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's updated continuously. So it's essentially refreshed with every release. So the
Okay.
book, it uses a service which points to a particular either commit or release branch under the hood. And so the book that you're seeing is a reflection of the latest release. I think that's right.
Yeah.
And then you can always just use the GitHub user interface
Okay.
to get a markdown representation of the book at main branch, so like the latest updates.
Got it.
So the
Okay.
process is that the documentation is updated continuously. So as features change,
Yeah.
that becomes a requirement of a PR merging. If a PR does something that changes the behavior that needs documentation updates, and that documentation typically is attached to that feature PR or that change PR, or in some cases even a bug fix PR. And then when that merges, and then when that is eventually released, typical release schedule for a minor release is every 2 months. Then the book that is available at the sort of canonical URL will refresh to
Yeah.
update to the latest release. That being said, there's always documentation is never at 100% fidelity. So
Yeah.
if anyone in the community ever sees something that
Yeah.
is either missing, then that would be welcome, and we could put that into a
Okay.
consider that a patch release, and then make sure that gets updated for the public quicker. Or if we can improve the documentation, so it's something that we do continuously.
Got it. Okay. My last question here is, Jack, and do I get any reference for the customers that's being using, like public informations that, okay, I know that I saw videos from Mercedes-Benz. They put out that video about how they migrated their hundreds of clusters into CAPI and CAPZ. But any other customer that I can refer, that I think Twilio is also using CAPI internally. But anything else that I can, when I need to propose to my customer, they also want to know about other customers using this one. Yeah, like it's not that popular yet compared to Terraform and other infrastructure as a code provider, but
Yeah.
but still, I feel that it's a very powerful tool, and then I know a couple of customers, they have showed their interest in this one.
I don't think there's any particular I think as representing the community, we probably don't want to document that. And so what we
Yeah.
hope to do is make everything as transparent as possible. And so you can discover that fairly easily. So one way would be often in the agenda like that.
Yeah.
Jack, you muted yourself.
How long have I been muted?
Like 10 seconds.
Okay, cool. So I was going to say it's customary in the agenda item, in the agenda notes for the meetings, for folks to capture what company they work for. So
Okay.
I would encourage you to use all the available
Sure.
public information that's there. I think that we probably won't advertise
Yeah.
company use cases it sort of seems a little bit
It makes sense.
not
Yeah, it makes
not the
sense.
place of the community.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But to the extent that anyone is willing to share that, like in their GitHub profile, because you can see who's contributing to the code,
Yeah.
that doesn't always correlate with who's using it. But I think there's enough public information where you can start to piece together the details. And I think we're all super open if you want to go in the CAPC Slack on Kubernetes or even DM folks. You know, I think that information could be found.
Awesome. Okay, great. Yeah, that's pretty much all my questions. Thank you, guys.
Cool. Mike T.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the Slack channel has, when I was first starting out, was super handy. So everybody there was super friendly, super helpful. Not just the people on this call, but just the community in general. So
Okay.
that's a good
I'll-
resource if you need it.
All right. Real quick, I know we have a couple. I know I have one bug fix that landed yesterday. I think there are some others. So I would like to advocate for I'm happy to lead it in the background, cutting patch releases for 114 and 113 today. And anyone on this meeting, and I'll post this in Slack as well, but anyone on this meeting certainly has veto power to say for any good reason that that's not a good idea. So is there any reason not to cut a patch release today? Cool. I know we need some maintainers to move the process along. Looks like we have enough. We have sufficient maintainership. So look for that sometime by end of day today. Okay, cool. Found the mute button in time. All right. Let's do a little bit of issue triage. I'm going to just go ahead and make an executive decision and not worry about milestone review for now. This is a project view. Is this? Let's just look at issues. Okay, cool. Seems so humble, that issue, doesn't it? It's going to involve a lot of PRs. All right. So CAPC upgrade failed to reconcile with worker cluster with the existing VNet subnet. Does anyone know anything about this? Ooh. What forbidden
the
characters
underscore.
are in there? Yeah. Interesting. I wonder why. Go ahead, John.
I wonder if this is kind of another flavor of the whole, like there are many ways you can name an Azure resource such that it's not a valid Kubernetes name that we would put in an ASO resource. I think there's a couple issues of that flavor around.
So you're saying this was a cluster built before ASO, and now it's trying to upgrade to a version of CAPC with ASO, and it's running into this?
That's what I would suspect, yeah.
Because that's the main thing I was thinking is why is if the VNet name isn't valid, how did this cluster get created in the first place? Go ahead, Mike.
So the Azure resource group allows the underscores, or the Azure names or the VNet allow the underscores, but the Kubernetes name that's assigned to the CR that's created does not. And so this would be one of those situations. I think there was something else in CAPZ that basically you could set the Kubernetes name to one thing, but the Azure resource name to something else. This is one of those sort of situations.
And that's no longer possible with ASO, John?
Well, I think that's just something that we didn't need before. So I think what Mike might be referring to is like agent pool names in AKS clusters where they have like super strict naming requirements.
Yeah.
so we make that possible to have separate names for like the Azure name versus the ASO name. Yeah, I think Nawaz had a PR a few weeks ago that I think we can leverage to make this easier.
Is the PR open or did it land?
It merged, but it kind of just it mainly added like a helper function to sanitize some of these names for when we populate ASO resource definitions. So I think that's something we can just plug in. I do want to take one extra close look to make sure that it won't change existing valid names, because that would cause some nasty side effects, I think. But I think if we can show that existing names aren't, or existing valid names aren't affected, then we should be good to kind of plug that in a few other places. It might be the use existing
This
virtual
one?
network from a different, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna say you investigate. $47.04. Okay, cool. That's a good lead. Thank you, John. All right. Adding AD extensions for VMSS and AKS created by Cluster API. John H. again.
Sorry, I want to back up a little bit. Should we be triaging some of these with priority labels as we go?
Oh yeah. Great. I think this sounds important. So is there a simple gesture / priority? I'll just do this. Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, there should be a / priority, I believe.
Yes. So is there a way to add 80 plugins via CAPC? It sounds like they're being added out of band, and then CAPC is not recognizing that from its version of things and overwriting it. Willie, is this related to any of the extension work you've done, or is that just super targeted to Fleet? And is there one more other extension that I can't recall?
Yeah, I don't think this is the same as like AKS extensions. But I can take a look into this and see if it's something that we can solve via extensions. Because I think there was that other feature that's the metrics thing that someone was asking for that was able to be solved by extensions.
Well, I also, I mean, is this something that the full AKS API, ASO AKS API will make easier as well?
Maybe John might have a better idea.
Yeah, I don't, at least my read of this is that this is for like the self-managed Azure machine pools and not the AKS. Oh, it does say an AKS cluster. So yes, I imagine that would help this then. But yeah, I think
I
this
mean,
would be worth
the
another
assumption is
look
that
anyway.
this is an AKS native thing and not a VMSS thing that you do. So we can clarify. I can clarify that. Are the AD extensions and AKS configuration? extension that you add after cluster relation to the DNSS. Hopefully that makes sense to him. It makes sense to me. It makes sense to you. So based on the answer to that, I think if it's a native AKS configuration, then it should be something that's in the ASO API. And for issues like this, I really would like to start suggesting to users to experiment with the new API in the near future, rather than adding this to the existing API. And I'm not saying that that will always be the case, but just at least an initial suggestion for users. Okay, so Willie, I see your avatar here. Is this something anybody's worked on?
I haven't started working on this, but this is just I think a bug that came up after migrating Edge cluster to ASO. So I think this is some things to do with the Kubernetes naming that was earlier talked about earlier, and it just kind of broke existing customers because I think it used to be allowed. So yeah, because these kinds of names are allowed on Azure, but not Kubernetes. John, I think you had your hand up, but I might have said.
Yeah, I was just going to mention what you already said about how this is, I think, the same flavor of like an Azure resource name is an invalid ASO resource name, and we need to massage that a little bit to get it to work.
Okay, so I can do some investigating into this one.
Okay, cool. Anyone know what vCluster is?
Yes. What's the question about vCluster?
I don't think I know what it is. So I'm willing to go on
Yeah,
the
so
record.
vCluster is basically a way of doing virtualized clusters on top of a Kubernetes cluster. And so it basically creates a partial API server control plane thing. So that, and then it syncs to the host cluster the resources necessary to create that thing. So let's say, for example, you create a deployment, it'll sync the deployment and pod resources to the host cluster, but if you create 100 config maps and none of them are being used, those 100 config maps will only exist inside that virtualized control plane. So it's a way of doing some both resource isolation as well as just virtualization for putting things where you need them.
Got it. Okay, cool.
It's a pretty cool project. You should check it out. But yeah.
Go ahead, John.
The only other context I have on this is that there is a PR open to fix this, and I do see it's linked there. And it looks like the solution they're proposing is basically to use the Azure Workload Identity webhooks instead of this hard-coded config that's being removed. But that's obviously failing our tests because we don't install the Workload ID webhooks. So, I mean, we need this configuration somehow, I think. But yeah, I guess I don't understand the whole vCluster thing enough to know if this is actually the best way to solve this.
Right.
Because it would,
okay.
yeah, because I would like to not have to tell people when they upgrade CabZ, oh, you also need to install these completely separate webhooks if you want workload ID. Because that could break existing clusters.
Right. I mean, a user could update the controller manager spec like this if this worked before. Yeah, go ahead. IT?
Yeah, so I think what the user is doing here is they have vCluster and then running cluster or CapZ inside of that vCluster. And then as it creates the pods in the host cluster, it's trying to mount these things. Whereas if that's not auto mounted like it's configured here, the webhook, when that pod is created, would inject what needs to be injected. So they're trying to make that workflow do its thing.
Right. Could we just prepare the? Yeah, it seems. I mean, is this a limitation of vCluster? It seems like it's not passing into the host cluster the required.
Can you scroll down just a little bit more to see what what the exact syntax? It's removing the project. Yeah, so what's gonna happen there is probably that service account token or something like that is being modified by vCluster when it does the injection into the host cluster.
Yeah.
Because basically it'll create that service account token inside of the vCluster and then do this rewrite thingy to have it be a real token inside of the host cluster. So this might be something that needs to happen on the vCluster side.
Okay. Got it.
Sure.
So I think I'm gonna. Okay. It's super awesome that we had those workload identity tests, by the way. Okay, so this is a little stale. Should I? Like, how is removing this from the? So if this service volume mount is no longer available on the V cluster, how is this going to work when? How is the host cluster ultimately going to work with workload identity? Is there some manual step he's doing?
Workload identity is probably the webhook or the webhooks for workload identity are probably running on the host cluster. So that when the pod is created on the host cluster, the admission webhook gets triggered that then injects the credentials automatically.
Got it. I mean, I wonder if how do we overload this spec? So this is input for cluster CTL right here, right? Like this is what cluster CTL hoists into the management cluster when you do infrastructure equals Azure. How is that overloadable? I suppose you have this kind of thing. Could we just overload this and have a V cluster gate, condition in here if you're in V cluster mode? Yeah.
Yeah, I've thought about that, and I wonder if there is some hack you could do with like sembers during releases where like we'd cut a whole separate release or
Yeah, no, that sounds too
something.
much.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of the only mechanism we have for instructing cluster CTL to use a modified configuration. Because yeah, I'm not sure if there's a way to do that kind of thing with just an environment variable.
Interesting. Is there some other bootstrapping mechanism that would serially follow the hoisting of this resource and then inject the volume, like update the resource spec So for example, if we added a feature flag for this, then I mean, these feature flags are obviously informing literally the runtime. So I don't know how we would, like, ideally, what we would be able to provide to the user is a simple flag they pass in, like I'm in V cluster mode. And then based on that, these volume mounts are here or not. All right. In the meantime, I'm going to ask the user what is happening right now. Not clear. This change may work for. Everything is so close, so slow on my keyboard. I think I need power in or something. Okay, it will break existing workload identity use cases in non-cluster. Updating. No. Okay, so based on the answer to that, we might be able to cover something. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I suspect the answer to that question is that they're not doing anything manual and they're using the webhooks to kind of do that same thing. I guess what's not clear to me is if, like, are the webhooks running in both the V cluster and the host cluster, or just the host cluster, or
Looks like probably just the host cluster.
what? Okay,
Yeah, I don't know enough about V cluster, so
neither
very
do I.
convenient that Mike was here to explain that. Okay, great. I think we have done some good low-level issue triage. It's enough, I think, for us to think about for the next few days, and let's get 7 to 8 minutes of our time back.
All right, thanks, Jack.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. See ya.